Well, Tánaiste, the
shameful consequences, human consequences of your failure in housing personified in Sam's tragic plight, I think, are well known. But I also want to highlight another fairly shameful failure of the government in the area of providing a key public service to the citizens of this country, namely in the area of public transport and bus services. Anybody who uses buses in this city will know, particularly at peak times, how frequently you wait for a bus. It doesn't turn up, it turns up late, or when it does turn up, there's such a queue you can't get on the bus. But we saw a report today in this week from the NTA, the performance reports on Go Ahead, the privatised bus service, and the privatisation of bus services, which is your policy, which you've pursued and implemented to hand out 10% of routes in this city to a private for-profit operator, and what the consequences of that are, where Go Ahead have consistently, since they took over, 24 routes in this city, 10% of the routes in 2018 have consistently failed to meet their performance targets. They got away with being fined for the first few months of that. Now fines are being imposed. But on route after route and overall in terms of their performance, they are failing to meet the performance targets that are set for them by the NTA. Discommoding, young people getting to school, workers, people with disabilities, all sorts of people who rely on a public transport system. And the point I want to make, Tánaiste, is that when you proposed the privatisation and outsourcing of routes, you said the reason to do so was it would be cheaper and the competition would produce better performance. Neither of those two things have turned out to be the case. Actually, Go Ahead's tender was a higher tender at 171 million than Dublin Bus, so it cost us more, and their performance is way below what Dublin Bus provides. And we all know that Dublin Bus's services could be a hell of a lot better as well. But the privatisation experiment has failed. You should acknowledge it and abandon the privatisation agenda in public transport. Because the truth is, if we want to do something about the climate, if we want to make our city work, if we want to deal with congestion, if we want to improve air quality, we need better, cheaper public transport. And you are going in precisely the opposite direction with the privatisation of routes. They are not cheaper, they are not better. At no level are they working to provide for the public transport needs of this city or this country. Will you accept we need to reverse the privatisation experiment and indeed put more money into providing better and cheaper public transport for our citizens?
Please.
Well, the first thing I'd say, Deputy, is that we are putting more money, a lot more money, into public transport projects right across Dublin, but right across the country too. Whether that's Bus Connects projects or whether it's light rail systems or whatever. But Deputy, you approach this from an ideological perspective. You know, privatisation for you is something that you can never accept on any level, on anything, whether it's housing, public transport, public-private partnerships to deliver schools, whatever it is. If there is a private sector element to any project that involves the state, you see that as something that is just unsupportable from an ideological point of view. And it's a blind spot. What we are doing in public transport is we are trying to provide the best possible public transport for people. And we are looking at certain routes where there should be and is competition to provide the best possible services. If people who win those contracts aren't performing to the standard of the contract that they've signed up to, then there are consequences to that, and so there should be. But there are plenty of private bus operators in the country who are doing a really good job. And there are also plenty of Dublin Bus and Bus Éireann services that are also really good. But when they are not delivering what they need to deliver, we have to pull them up on it, whether it's public or private. The issue for the government is the delivery of the service, not whether it's public or private. And that is how we are approaching the delivery of public transport. The vast majority of public transport in Ireland is being provided and supported, and supported by the state, and that's the way it should be. But there is absolutely nothing wrong with certain routes being opened up to competition that Bus Éireann or Dublin Bus can actually compete for if they want. But if somebody else is providing a different proposition that gives better outcomes for commuters, well, then we should be encouraging that. And we should be encouraging private sector investment to deliver those solutions, which is what we're doing. But if certain companies are not delivering what they promised in the context of those contracts, well, then there is a consequence to that. That's built into the contract, and as you said yourself, that may result in fines.
Free public transport and better public transport. That is incompatible with private sector investment, because private sector investment is about profit. And you have not put more money into Dublin Bus, at least. In 2008, there was 85 million in subvention going into Dublin Bus, and we had 1,200 buses. Today, there's 41 million going into Dublin Bus, and we have 1,115 buses. Less subvention, less buses, more people needing and using those buses, and higher fares, and poorer performance. And then you make a bad situation worse by privatising it, and Go Ahead, since they've come in, have admitted themselves their poor performance was related to, quote, higher than expected driver resignations. Wonder why that is. Might it have anything to do with the poor conditions and poor pay of those bus drivers? 4,000 complaints on just 10% of the routes since the beginning of this year against Go Ahead bus services, who, by the way, also gave very poor performance in public transport provision in Britain, where the privatisation of public transport has been a disaster. How can we get more people into public transport if it is privatised, if it's for profit, if fares are too high, and if performance is as bad as we're seeing from Go Ahead?
Tánaiste.
Deputy, when you talk about free public transport, there's no such thing. If the state... No, sorry, listen to me. In those countries, there's no such thing as free public transport. The state decides to pay for it or subsidise it if they want to do it. Whether that is through a private sector company that's delivering the service or whether it's a public sector company, doesn't make any difference. If free public transport, if we choose to subvent and support it, will be a policy choice and a budgetary choice. It's not free just because we decide to declare it free. Someone's got to pay for it. Either the consumer pays for it or the state pays for it. Whether it's being provided by a private sector company or a public company. So you shouldn't present it as something that it isn't. I come back to what I said before. It's the outcomes that matter here in the context of a delivery of efficient public transport, whether that's buses or trains or anything else. And I don't hold a candle for any company that's providing a service here, whether they be state or private. We have a regulator to do that job. And if people don't meet the standards that are being set for them, there needs to be a consequence for that. But as I said to you before, there are many private sector bus companies in the country who, in my view, are doing a great job, as indeed are Bus Éireann on many routes, as is Dublin Bus.
Deputy Jones.